Well, I think I will take over. So Henry is joining us. Henry, Lindsay, and I are working on a paper on the WTO and trying to understand where it has been for the last 25 years and where it will be going into the future. We're going to listen to each of our distinguished panelists for a few minutes, and then we'll have a broader discussion. We'll start with Dr. Howes, and we'll take it over from there.
Thank you very much. And I have to start with an apology, which is due to a class that I have to teach. I'm going to have to jump off at roughly 11:40. Secondly, a disclaimer, I in fact do not have a doctorate. And in America, I would say probably still the majority of law professors don't have them. And I'm always terrified, especially when I go to Germany and somebody introduces me as doctor, because apparently there it's actually a criminal offense to hold out that you have a PhD when you don't have one. And I kind of recall some German politician who ran afoul of this, and I don't think that they were actually prosecuted, but it certainly was harmful to their career. So no PhD. So this is a very interesting political moment, obviously, and it's hard not to start off without acknowledging it. Today, there was a decisive step forward in the selection of the new Director General. With the view coming out, at least from the Troika, that there's strong momentum for the Nigerian candidate, Ngozi Okonjo. At the same time, we learned not too long ago that the United States is supporting her opponent, Yu, from South Korea. Both of them were educated in the United States, interestingly. Yu, as a lawyer who actually became a member of the New York Bar, and Ngozi Okonjo as a development economist. And Ngozi actually is an American citizen. So this is a rather extraordinary event where the United States is ending up supporting the candidate opposed to its own citizen, which I think is actually kind of a nice contribution to the evolution of global governance, although I doubt the administration intended it that way. My own view is that both are extremely well qualified and will use what is often referred to as the crisis or of the WTO, sometimes even more pessimistically as its demise, as an opportunity, to move forward in different directions. So what might those directions possibly be? First of all, it seems to me that the blockage of the appellate body and the resulting question mark in front of legalistic dispute settlement at the WTO, which is something that I've embraced and made in much of my scholarly career is based on engaging with that jurisprudence, that this may present some opportunities to develop the WTO further as a forum for policy dialogue and information exchange. And it seems to me that the constructive role the WTO was able to play on very short notice in the COVID crisis, gathering information about members' measures and trying to create a certain degree of sober second thought concerning the knee-jerk resort to export restrictions and closure of borders presages, some such possibilities, and especially since consensus on, the negotiation of new legal rules is one of the most elusive aspects of the functioning of the WTO. This policy dialogue, soft law role in global deliberation about trade, again, it seems to me is going to be an important part of the organization's future and an important part of the way in which it can be successful in the future. What not to go in the direction of, as I've recently argued in the Journal of International Economic Law, don't try and address the Trump administration's conflict with China through attempting to make new rules for 160 or whatever countries in the WTO. So if whatever complaints the administration may have, and some of them are quite valid at a certain level if you interpret them correctly, about subsidies or state enterprises in China, it's certainly not a reason to circumscribe subsidies and state enterprises and their role in economic governance, especially in a time of pandemic. I think also that obviously the other delicate political moment, besides the selection of the final selection of the WTO DG, is the United States election, and I think it would be hard to write, a current speech about the future of the WTO without, in effect, having two speeches. What happens if Trump is reelected, and what happens if there's a new administration? My general sense is that a Biden administration would be very good news for the WTO. First of all, the foreign policy team behind Biden are very engaged by the project of affirming American commitment to multilateralism in a range of contexts. So the WTO, I suspect, will be one of those contexts, and the value of re-engaging as a leader in the WTO to the United States will be not seen in narrowly commercial terms, but also in terms of this broader attempt to reestablish America's stature and salience in multilateral institutions. On the other hand, in my view, quite wisely, Biden, to the extent that he's set out some policy parameters on these questions, has said he will not be rushing into new trade agreements. And here he means bilateral or regional agreements. For example, the neoliberal wing, as represented by the Peterson Institute, would love for a Biden administration to jump on the bandwagon of the CPTPP. I don't think Biden is going to do that, and one reason is that these regional agreements are likely to be divisive within the Democratic Party because progressives don't want them unless they have very far-reaching commitments on environment and labor. So this is another consideration where the Biden administration's initial focus on trade might well be much more in the WTO arena, and the question is how to capture the advantages of that for the organization, and also what are the downside risks, because more American leadership, depending upon who President Biden listens to, the neoliberals, big tech, big pharma, which had fully the ear of the Obama trade people, or progressives who are skeptical about big tech, want to break it up, and want to curb, the uses and abuses of intellectual property by big pharma. What we see in terms of the way in which the United States throws its weight around, if it does re-engage with the WTO, may be quite different. One good sign, and I believe Sorry, lost the connection there for a moment. Other panelists may address it, is the Biden administration has made a big commitment to significantly reducing, perhaps eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. And if they want to multilateralize that commitment, then there's a possibility finally that issue, which I and others have been pushing to be brought into the WTO, will in fact be brought into the WTO. But I think my time is almost up. Just one comment about dispute settlement. Instead of mourning the appellate body or creating a placebo for it, a kind of slightly absurd exercise that the EU and Canada and certain other states have engaged in, why not take the opportunity to revisit the panel process? And my friend and colleague Petros Mavroidis and Bernard Hoekman have written, I think, an important paper advocating this. It's a golden opportunity to improve professionalism among panelists, to examine the way that panels do their work, to perhaps think about best practices for panels, given that there isn't going to be a new appellate body tomorrow morning. Of course, if the Biden administration wanted to unblock appellate body appointments in its first 100 days, it could do that, but then who would the United States want as an appellate body member? That's sure to engage some discussion within the Democratic Party among those who are interested in or concerned with trade and globalization. But why not think about how we can improve panels, improve panel practice, not, for example, have panel reports like the GMO report, 1,000 pages of incomprehensible, obscure reasoning, often contradicting, the panel contradicting itself at different points, because obviously it's very hard to edit a document of that length, much less to have a document of that length as a legitimate expression of the law that can be understood by stakeholders, concerned citizens, informed journalists, and so on. So if we improve the panel process enough, the appellate body may be, in any case, less necessary, or the stakes will not be as high. And in fact, many of the problems, I think this was really displayed, for example, in the Tuna 2 case, that arise in some of the appellate body rulings that are, I would say, problematic, is that a lot of the issues are mixed questions of fact and law, and incompetent or biased fact finding by panel. I don't mean bias in the sense of a corrupt or material interest, but in terms of ideological or professional orientation by the panels. It's hard to correct. The appellate body couldn't ever hear appeals on matters of fact. And indeed, the time frame in which it's called upon to decide would not in any case allow for a thorough correction of defective fact finding. So improve the quality of panelists as fact finders. So all of these, I think, are opportunities that are presented even in this moment of crisis that can be seized regardless of whether today on October 28th, we can really predict how the big politics will shape up in the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. That's much appreciated, and apologies for turning up late. These are the joys of Zoom. That was really interesting. I'd like to turn now, if I may, to Kolo Kugler, Counsel at the Advisory Center in WTO Law in Geneva. Kolo, are you there? Or am I, Kolo? You with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Henry, for the kind invitation.
Thank you, Kolo.
And it is really my pleasure to join this panel to discuss very interesting, I guess, pressing issues in international trade governance. As Henry said, I work at the Advisory Center in WTO Law, and I would like to say that the opinions that I'm voicing today are my own, and in no way affiliated or reflect the views of the organization which I work for. And I am going to present, or just spend a few minutes to discuss about what are the pressing international trade issues that are facing developing countries right now. And I am going to address 3 issues in particular. One is the definition of developing country. The second is what Rob has already spoken to, is the situation or facing the appellate body, which is spilling over into the dispute settlement system of the WTO. And lastly, I am going to discuss the rising protectionism and just touching or really highlighting the US-China trade war and the implications on developing countries. So I will just, in all of the 3 topics we'll discuss, of course, briefly give a brief background as to what's happening and just highlight the implications of what's happening to developing countries. So first of all, the definition of developing country. As you know, or as we all know, developing country or developed country at the WTO is not defined, right? Members self-select, and the only category of members that are predetermined or defined are LDCs, least developed countries, and the WTO uses the UN's list. But otherwise, all members predetermine or select their level of development. And obviously, this is important for special differential treatment, especially for developing countries and least developed countries. So those countries that are defined or select themselves to be developing countries can invoke or can use these special differential treatment provisions. And as we know, special differential treatment, or SDT, can be described by the 4 L's, right? Later in terms of the start date of obligations, longer in terms of the timeframes of obligations, lower in terms of the amount of obligations, and less in terms of the scope of obligations. Now, these issues, although very political, as you may imagine, and as you know, have come up in disputes, and the panels and appellate bodies have actually sidestepped and avoided making rulings on members developing country status for obvious reasons, because this is a very political and sensitive issue. But a member self-designation as a developing country is not dispositive, which means that other members can challenge it. And a member's decision not to grant SDT is also, members can also have the right not to grant SDT. This can also be challenged, of course. Now, recently what has come up is that the US has put up a paper for discussion to just basically say that the situation is not tenable. We cannot have all developing countries, and developing countries of the WTO make up 2/3 of the membership, so about 150 countries, all of them being, treated the same way. There's some members that are very wealthy and well-off, and there's some members obviously that are very weak. And the US contends that the members that are weak and those that are not strong economically should have full recourse to SDT, and all the other members should not. And so the US has come up with criteria that it thought that should be adopted, or actually thought about, to determine which members should qualify for special differential treatment and which should not. And so the US came up with a draft General Council decision in February 2019, and it revised it in November of 2019, and basically said that if the member fulfills the following categories, they shall not avail themselves to special differential treatment for current and future WTO negotiations. So first, a member that is a member of the OECD or has begun the process of joining the OECD. A member that is a member of the group of 20 countries, the G20. A member that the World Bank has classified as high income for 3 consecutive years. And a member that accounts for no less than 5% of global trade for 3 consecutive years. So of course, some developing country members were very incensed about, they were very upset about this, and notably members such as China, India, South Africa, and Venezuela, which were later joined by other members such as Cuba and Kenya, responded to the US saying basically that there is a continuous relevance for special differential treatment. All of these indicators are not, accurate and are not objective, because sometimes members can have a high GDP per capita or GNI per capita, but have a very low score in terms of human development issues. And obviously this was then the US continued to take a step further because I guess in its opinion that these things are not being resolved. These have been happening for many, many years. And some members, especially of course, the member that is the elephant in the room, China, and others of course, have been benefiting from being a developing country in the WTO unchecked basically. And so in February 2020, the US issued a notice on the designation of developing and least developed countries under its countervailing duty law, in which it excluded certain countries from being excluded from countervailing duties, which is provided for in Article 27 of the SCM agreement. So basically, it used the criteria that it proposed in its paper beforehand, and it excluded countries that have high-income countries above $12,375, which is countries like Mauritius and Panama, and the Caribbean countries like Barbados and the Bahamas. Share of world trade that is over 0.5%. Countries like India and Brazil and Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam were excluded, obviously. And then there was a category called other factors, and this includes EU membership, OECD membership, and if a member considers itself to be a developed country in its own WTO accession. So this is obviously applicable to economies in transition. Economies like Kazakhstan and Albania and such, that actually in the accession document said that we do not avail ourselves to SDNT. Now, obviously, this, as I said before, is a very political and very sensitive issue, but it has to be resolved because it creates the scope for individual countries to unilaterally exclude other countries based on arguably questionable criteria. For example, the G20 membership does not consider level of development or the strength of the economy or level of world trade. For example, South Africa, India, and Indonesia are members of the G20, while Switzerland, Norway, and New Zealand are not. So arguably, this could be a very questionable criteria to exclude a certain developing country from this special and differential treatment. And obviously, lack of agreement leaves countries vulnerable to coercion. And I mean, there's been members over the last 2 years that have basically said that they're going to renounce their ability to invoke SDNT or to use SDNT in negotiations. Countries like Brazil, Chinese Taipei, Korea, Singapore have renounced SDNT. And so that basically deals with the developing country. And of course, we can discuss this further as we do not have much time to go into the details right now. The second most pressing issue facing developing countries, I would argue right now, is the appellate body impasse and the concomitant fallout that is caused in the dispute settlement system. As we know, everybody knows that the appellate body right now cannot adjudicate or cannot hear appeals because there are no sufficient members, and this has been the case since the 11th of December 2019. We know that the panel process is ongoing, but of course we're seeing the effects now. And so far, we see that there are less disputes that have been initiated. So far in 2020, only 3 disputes have been initiated in comparison to 2019, where 19 disputes were initiated. In 2018, 38 disputes were initiated. And in 2017, 17 disputes were initiated. Also, since December 2019, 6 disputes have been appealed into the void. And 3 of those are by the United States and 1 each by Russia, the EU, and Saudi Arabia. So basically, this means that these disputes are going to stay suspended until the appellate body is composed with enough members or division to hear these disputes. Of course, we've had some members, notably the EU, start to think about how we're going to solve this conundrum. And EU and 24 members have agreed to the MPIA, which is an interim appeal arbitration mechanism that members that have joined this group will resolve the appeals in this way. But of course, the vast majority of WTO members, and notably the biggest ones, or some of the biggest ones, are not part of this MPIA. Now, obviously, the situation in the DSM is not tenable specifically for developing countries, because the benefit of a working dispute settlement system are the following. It equalizes the playing field where countries like Antigua and Barbuda and Pakistan can challenge countries and measures adopted by the US and EU respectively. It depoliticizes trade disputes. Without the rules-based DSM, poor and weaker countries are susceptible to power politics and to wrangling. And obviously it has a disciplining effect for all players, specifically even for those developing countries that do not use the dispute settlement system. The fact that there's a rules-based system disciplines the bigger country in some way. So when there is no functioning system, obviously the weakest players stand to lose. And finally, just in a few seconds, because we are running out of time, I will raise the third issue that I argue is one of the most pressing issues facing developing countries at the moment, international trade regulation, and that's the raising levels of protectionism. There's research that shows that since the aftermath of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, protectionism has been on the rise. Generally, the use of tariff and non-tariff measures have been increasing increased use by G20 countries since then. And just to note, G20 countries account for 75% of world trade. And obviously, the obvious examples that we've seen is the UK leaving the EU, Brexit, and the US having adopted a particularly inward-looking and protectionist stance. And also in the light of COVID-19, which will be discussed in more detail later, we've seen members adopting measures to limit import and exports. And then, of course, is the US-China trade war, which makes developing countries particularly vulnerable to power politics. And obviously, as you can remember, when the US adopted the steel and aluminum tariffs, there were some exceptions that some members were able to get, or some countries were able to get, that other countries weren't able to get. And obviously, this leaves a very sort of big part for developing countries to lose out, especially on very valuable market access. And of course, these actions have been challenged. China has challenged the Section 301 Trade Act measures that it's taken. But as I said to you before, or mentioned, that actually this panel report was issued on the 15th of September, and the US has appealed it into the void on Monday. So obviously this circles back to the second point that I mentioned right now, which is the weak or the almost dysfunctional dispute settlement system. I will stop right here, but basically just to say that some of these issues are very pressing and very pressing on the most vulnerable members of the WTO and vulnerable countries in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kolo. Just a quick reminder for everybody to please put questions into the chat, and then we'll be picked up after everyone's had a go for the Q&A. I'd like to turn now, if I may, to Professor Andrew Lang, Chair, International Law and Global Governance, just down the road at the University of Edinburgh. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Henry. Thanks for the invitation to the panel. Thanks to all the other panel members for their thoughts, and hi to all the other participants. Thanks for joining. So, like the speakers who have spoken so far, I'm just going to place three, I think, issues on the table. We'll see how my time goes. Those three issues are trade and climate change, MFN recognition, and if I get a chance to talk a little bit about dispute settlement, I will. Okay, so jumping right into it, just on the issue of climate change, I start with what I want to say about this in the United States. And actually what I have to say, I think, jumps off a little bit what Rob had to say earlier. So obviously no one knows what the result's going to be next week. It's a huge unknown, but for the moment, let's imagine a Biden victory and think about what the strategic imperatives will be for the new administration in the realm of trade policy. So I don't think anyone thinks that it will be a return to business as usual or a full embrace of the multilateral system as it was in 2015-16, but it will be a pivot. And I think there will be a need to balance a few things. So one, exactly as Rob said, I'm sure that any new administration would want to swiftly signal a clear change of direction and a reaffirmation of a commitment to multilateralism of some sort. At the same time, the trick will be doing that without giving up the real leverage that I think it's true that the last 4 years have created for the United States and whatever momentum for change that there is in it, as a result of the last 4 years. And what's more, this signal will have to be sent without giving anything to China. In fact, continuing a hard line vis-a-vis China. I think that's a constraint that any new administration would continue with. And then I think a fourth constraint would simply be that at the same time, domestically, they would want to rebuild a domestic coalition in favour of a broadly multilateral, though changed, trade policy, which can credibly claim to be neither a continuation of the current situation nor just a return to the old. So I think they're the sort of, for me, if I had to lay out what the strategic imperatives would be for some form of new trade policy, it would be those on the United States. And I think given, if that's true, then there are a few things which could conceivably fit within that space. But one of them seems to me to be trade and climate change. And as many of you will know, certainly my colleagues on the panel will know, there's already small but I think real momentum behind some initiatives in the WTO, but also in bilateral and regional venues, which I think could get further momentum if the US were to lend some weight and engagement to them. So remember Buenos Aires statement from the 12 on fossil fuel subsidies. That also built on the 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goals, on some work in the G20 and the G7 and APEC on fossil fuel subsidies. As of late last year, we have the ACCTS initiative, which is a trade and climate change agreement within the WTO. At least that's working towards one, a small plurilateral, which would include fossil fuel subsidies, environmental goods and services, voluntary eco-labeling. So there's existing initiatives. And it seems to me that there's quite a lot to be gained for some potential Biden administration in engaging with that. I mean, as Rob said, we saw just recently, in fact, Biden specifically saying, the plan is to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. It seems to me a genuinely green trade agenda is something that his coalition, domestic coalition, could get behind if it's combined with tough action on other issues. Certainly I was asked to speak from a UK and European perspective, certainly from UK and European perspective, that sort of agenda clearly chimes with an existing agenda. There are already strong constituencies in favour of that domestically. And it strikes me as an agenda item which would be a useful way of trying to rebuild common positions and objectives with friends across the Atlantic on an agenda item in which, at least amongst that group, there's quite clear commonality of interest. And also, given that New Zealand is a key player driving this, they've already started putting some provisions in FTAs, such as their ones with Singapore on this. They're negotiating with the EU and the UK, obviously, on their FTAs. I think there's space to build some momentum around this over the next, I'm talking medium term, over the next several years, medium term. So that's the first issue. And the claim I'm making there is basically that depending on what happens next week, there is some space in the next 5 to 10 years to make real progress on that agenda. And in fact, I think there's more space now than there was 4 years ago to make progress on that sort of agenda. Right, the second issue is MFN and recognition. So we all been saying for decades that continues to be an erosion of the fundamental principle of MFN, which was so important, a part of the GATT from its early days, and this has been worrying a lot of people for a long time. I think that anxiety is broadly right, though I would characterize the position slightly differently. The core principle for me, the fundamental normative principle, was not really ever that one should accord MFN treatment to all GATT or WTO members in some absolute sense. It was always that MFN treatment should be accorded to everyone in the absence of good reasons not to. And I don't mean to split hairs by saying this. I just think we need to just make that qualification clear if we're to take account of the fact that there have always been, we all know, lots of exceptions to MFN, which reflected situations in which GATT contracting parties, WTO members, thought and still think that it's perfectly justified not to adhere strictly to MFN. So think of preferential treatment for developing countries, think of comprehensive pro-liberalization preferential agreements, think of targeted trade remedies, think of national security. These are all important normative parts of the regime alongside MFN. So really, and this is the point of what I'm saying, the problem is not to stop the erosion of MFN. It's really to reaffirm the MFN principle in the sense that I've just described. In other words, to reaffirm the importance of the principle with a clear statement of the circumstances in which it is not justified to depart from MFN and the circumstances in which it is. In other words, there's some difficult normative work to be done, and it's a hard balance to get it right. So the problem now is not erosion of MFN per se, it's that departures from MFN which are unjustified, which are heavily politicized in the negative sense, which seek to divide countries, which undermine a spirit of multilateralism generally. And that's what we've seen, obviously, over the last few years. Now, that's a long way round of getting to what I wanted to say about recognition. But this is really what I wanted to say, which is that I think the recognition agreements and the practice of recognition and equivalence needs to be part of that MFN conversation a little bit more than it currently is. I think it's been recognized since the Uruguay round that recognition arrangements can be very, very positive, that WTO members should generally be encouraged to use them, and they need the flexibility to do so if that's going to happen effectively. But also, obviously, they can turn into a kind of discrimination when they're pursued in an arbitrary or not an even-handed manner. And I think both sides of that are reflected in the WTO agreements. Obviously, I'm thinking of GATS Article 7, Annex on Financial Services, SPS Article 4, and so on. But there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, in the text about the exact balance that is struck and how those provisions will be applied. This has been more or less okay for a long time because recognition arrangements are rare and have been rare and quite isolated, but that's a lot less the case now. I think it's quite possible that recognition arrangements, equivalence decisions in various different areas are having and will continue to have as much of an impact in fragmenting the trading system as other much more talked about measures which are happening right now. So I guess this second point is just to say that in this larger context of a discussion of MFN and where we are, I can see a lot of value in getting much more clarity about the precise role, if any, of the multilateral system in overseeing recognition arrangements, ensuring their integrity. And that seems to me to be another important issue for the next 5-10 years. If I have time, and here I'm seeing a nod from Henry. Okay, let me just say one or two words about dispute settlement. This seems to me to be an area which is obviously super important, but going to be extremely hard to fix at the multilateral level. I don't foresee any rapid change in the current dynamics, whatever the outcome next week. I'm not saying that everyone in the US agrees with the US criticism, nor with the way it's been expressed, but I think that now that matters have come to a head, it doesn't make much sense to let that tension dissipate without some movement. And also, I think it's pretty hard to see that issue being resolved, except as part of a broader resolution of some of the substantive issues on the content of the law, which relate in particular to US-China relations. So it feels to me like it's going to be at least a medium-term task to rebuild that. I don't see any swift change of direction as a result of next week's election. Now, I don't pretend to know how to go about that medium-term task, and I don't have specific changes that I would propose. I just wanted to say this, and this is not new, but just to say whatever that solution is, I think it has to get at the fundamental problem, which for me is the absence of an effective political, membership response when the appellate body gets it wrong. And I'm not saying the appellate body has got it wrong or hasn't got it wrong, but I'm just merely making the point that I think has been clear to everyone for ages, that this imbalance between the judicial and the political side was always a major problem. And in some sense, the current crisis reflects that underlying structural problem. And so it's hard to see a solution which doesn't get at that in some way. Now, of course, it's an indescribably difficult task to address that problem while keeping intact the key characteristics of independence and impartiality, which are obviously central. And on that note, I just wanted to say a small point, which is that I think there's a case to be made for some little bit of experimentation with institutional structure at the bilateral free trade agreement level to gain a little bit of experience and confidence with them. And what I have in mind here is I've just been doing some work recently on prudential filter mechanisms in different trade agreements. Obviously, they've been around since NAFTA, but they've been redesigned in some interesting ways in the USMCA, CPTPP, CETA, some Australian bilaterals, and others. To some extent, these filter mechanisms, they can be, they're interesting to look into, no question about that. To some extent, they're political circuit breakers, and to the extent that they are that, then they undermine a legal process. But looked at differently, I think they can be seen as useful mechanisms for ensuring a greater degree of non-tribunal input into what still remains a legal decision-making process. I'm not suggesting that prudential filter mechanisms are a solution in any sense, but it just strikes me that as we get more experience of those sorts of mechanisms in the bilateral and regional context, some variant of that might emerge as a potential way forward internationally. That's all I had to say on those three issues, so I'm looking forward to the discussion later. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That's really helpful, really interesting. Just a reminder, please put your questions into the chat, where Lindsay will expertly manage them and direct to the panelists afterwards. We've had to lose Rob, unfortunately. I'd like to ask Professor Gabrielle Marceau to please say a few words. Gabrielle is Senior Counselor at the Research Division of WTO, and has been described as one of the top lawyers at the WTO, which is quite a handy shorthand as I keep losing track of what particular post she holds at any given time. So, Gabrielle, over to you.
Thank you, Henry, Shane, Alexandra, for the organization, the invitation. We're already 20 minutes late, so I will cut some things, but allow me to say 3-4 things about what was said. And my presentation focuses on COVID and how I believe it will change governance within the WTO. The few things and sorry, I may shock some of you, on this issue of developing country, I think we should start with the premise that the only international law rule is that all states are equal. They're equal. Second point, I'd like to support Andrew. I believe that mutual recognition, I've started a research project because yes, I left legal division, 25 years of dispute for research, and I work on this topic, in particular in the context of the new GSI. These subgroups that are not plurilateral, that have to fit, but I just want to prove that. On the MPIA, in case we don't have the time to discuss, I would say, and I agree with Rob, he's left, and also with Andrew, we need to deal with substance after such a crisis if we want to. But to me, the appellate body will not come back. It's not possible, even if it's for the sake of the pride of the United States. Some things like the MPIA could, but I believe in many MPIAs, many Article 25 type regional sort of appeal system. It will reduce the political tension of one court, and we could use this to develop or explore solutions. But my point today, as I mentioned, is the COVID situation and how from inside it has changed, or it may change further, the governance. You know, there's this say I was told in English, never miss a good crisis, that crisis can often trigger things. In WTO, it started in 2008 with the financial crisis, when the then DG Lamy suggested to countries that they notify their restrictions somewhere to the WTO, and the G20 asked the WTO to do that, and it developed some sort of addition to its TPR process, whereby, as it is done for COVID now, a COVID page was set up, And all countries notified all their restrictions, support and all this with a view to develop maybe best practices, but mainly try to collaborate and coordinate, because it became clear that they had a need for sort of coordination, collaboration, and this was done in the context of COVID, a transparency hub. The WTO wants to become the transparency hub of the trade-related measures to COVID. Of course, COVID is a health issue, we know, but with health, there's movement of respirators, medicine and all that, and there are issues related to COVID that are also trade, such as prohibiting people from going out where business lose money, so you need to give subsidies. There are many areas of WTO that is sort of full pin in action because of COVID. But the one thing that has surprised me, and I'll try to share a document with you, is I learned today how to share documents, is here. The amount of bilateral, regional, and all sorts of form of cooperation, coordination, and I ask Pascal, my assistant, so what's the difference between coordination, collaboration, and cooperation? And you will see why I talk about that. We have about close to 30 declarations of governments and members saying they coordinate, they want to collaborate, cooperate, and really, I didn't know. So we looked in the dictionaries, sorry, the British dictionaries again, to see what's the differences. And basically, it's work together in a general term. But the point I want to share with you, and these are some examples of what could be differences between these different terms, but I'll take you slowly into a set of those sort of agreements. So there are many of those agreements that you can see on the COVID page, and that are what we call IGO. So you have the classic ones where the red and green line that the customs were agreed and developed. You have those about agriculture, because you may have read on the press, COVID led to a lot of food problem in some countries. It's not necessarily that there's no food, but there's no one to collect things, and there's no one to distribute. There's blockage of transportation and planes. I found out that chicken apparently are grown often from eggs that arrive from Brazil or Thailand on planes. If there's no plane, there's no eggs, there's no chicken. So you had this long list of IGO type collaboration. There are also what is mentioned here, IGO, NGO, and here I use NGO in the WTO sense, that is anything that is not government, whether it's a company, a chamber of commerce, a hospital, university. And this is where these things are new and not so new, but they come up. A lot of some people call it private-public partnership. However you label them, it's of a different nature. Of course, the COVAX, this big vaccination scheme where you have multinationals full of money and non-profit companies and governments, etc. And it's the same, the vaccine we knew, the WTO and the ICC, Chamber of Commerce. And here I'm just going down. We try to group them, IGO, government, NGO, and it's quite, to me, positive. This realization that if we want to get out of this COVID crisis, everybody will have to pitch in and work. And it's true also for supply chains, for instance. People talk about supply chains. This cannot be done just by governments. Supply chains involve business decision of what you're going to buy, when, and send where. These involve investment, competition, the old Singapore issues. So if you want to talk about supply chain here in the WTO, as some people are suggesting, we need to have more tools and different partners, whether on a permanent basis or not. There's an impressive, I mentioned, a list of government-to-government declarations. Of course, These are just declaration, but it's interesting that as of, I think, 3 or 8 March, already Singapore and New Zealand started talking about connectivity, a supply chain, and then encouraged other governments to join in. And it took 2 weeks, and the same group of government joined in for food and agriculture, and the quality of those sort of commitments are interesting and could be, if it's too difficult in the WTO, could be experienced or checked or in regional trade agreements. So here I'm going down with different statements, just it can be useful. Those that are more interesting or surprising for me are the multi-parties, where you go from government to NGO, public or private, and individual. And the list is long. This is a 6-page list, even at the level of canton here in Switzerland, where all sorts of sort of agreements are reached, not only for vaccination, because as you know, when you go in a hospital, you need bed, you need sheet. It's unbelievable. All the applications developed on the phone involve collaborations of multiple entities, Google or others, that are often in competition in normal circumstances. So, and in all countries. I will simply finish in saying that in terms of governance, the other area where things change for quite a bit is that on this COVID page, where governments are invited to explain their actions, and where we compile all those government-to-government declaration, not the private ones, there's also a new section, a new role for the Secretariat, papers from the Secretariat available on COVID issues, whether export restrictions, whether trade in animals, all the relevant aspects. And this is new, and it's a plus, because the Secretariat traditionally here in WTO, it's supposed to be member-driven. Well, all organizations, international organizations, are driven by government. They're made by governments, but still there is this old idea that the staff doesn't exist and it's behind curtains. But for the first time, these papers were done by a group of staff across the WTO divisions, not only research, and very much appreciated by members of the WTO. You are younger than me, you must know that they count the clicks. And I think that for the e-commerce and the impact of COVID on e-commerce and WTO related rule, they were close to, I think it's, forgot the number, 60,000, but it responds to a need. And I'm happy to end with this message that this crisis may have led to a space for the Secretariat to be a bit more analytical. There's still resistance. There was an offer to analyze further in the area of food, the supply chains, and it was resisted by our big friend, but still, it's a positive step in this dark time. On this, I'll stop here and I thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was good at sharing. I learned 3 times today.
That was great. I actually didn't know that we could do that in this setting, so that's super. Feel free, everybody. No, that was really, really interesting. Thank you very much, Gabrielle. Particularly, I think you illustrate very nicely the centrality of both international institutions in cooperation to addressing COVID, but also the centrality of WTO itself to these efforts and how the organization is being slightly recast and perhaps finding its feet again in this in this context. Perhaps we can explore more in the Q&A.
I think you're a bit too generous, but that's the way I see some light. Thank you.
No, that's fantastic. Rostam, I hope you will. My very dear, very old friend Rostam, who I haven't seen for more than 20 years. But wonderful to see you on camera. Head of Department of Global Legal Studies at University of Macau, Faculty of Law there. Rostam, will you shed some more light, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Henry. In fact, really good to see you, if only virtually, unfortunately, after such a long time. And also thank you for inviting me to such an illustrious discussion. I actually, I'm now, my head is spinning because it's also pretty late here from Macau. I'm already fighting a bit my sleep, but there were so many interesting issues raised, and I must say that I'm currently, as you mentioned, as a head of global legal studies, I'm a bit frustrated because and sad about the current crisis, which is in fact a global pandemic. So it is by definition a global event, which unfortunately, from my perspective, and we physically experienced that through like restrictions in travel, has been dealt with not just nationally or domestically, but really at the local levels, even in my home country. Now there is all of a sudden a difference between one village and the other again. And this I see as a large setback, especially if you remember where we met at McGill during my studies as a student. I was inspired, and I blame my former supervisor, Patrick Glenn, for ending up here in Macau, where I live now for 13 years, because he was writing the book on the legal traditions of the world and showing that I think legal diversity is a way to sustainability and not an obstacle to cooperation. And especially, I think this idea stayed with me forever and inspired me, and all my research is following, trying to find ways how to overcome obstacles, conflicts, contradictions. My most recent interest was more like in language, and especially paradoxes and oxymoron, which are at least the beginning of a cognitive or a linguistic way of trying to overcome maybe some of these apparent contradictions. And I'm extremely happy also to see online Andrew Lang, because he wrote an article in 2007, which came too late for my PhD thesis, which was about the trade linkage debate and the culture and trade debate in particular, which is the second line of my research interest. And you said that, if I remember correctly, and I quoted it again in this article that I recently contributed to this book about the post-WTO order, that cognitive change is necessary for a transformational change and institutional reform. And in fact, I was hoping that already the global financial crisis in 2008 was such a moment where I thought like, this could be a crisis, another golden opportunity, as Rob House said, or Gabriel Marceau said just now, like you don't want to miss it. But I think we missed a lot of them already. And I was also, during my time of the PhD in Florence, worked very enthusiastically. First, we embraced the creation of the WTO as students and researchers, then the project for a European constitution. And now 20 years later, I see it all like being one missed opportunity after another. And we are getting further away from the, I think, ideal of a global legal framework, which is coherent and functioning and helping to settle conflicts peacefully and hopefully even avoid them. And I think also you mentioned trade and climate change and many other trade and pairs, which are in my, from my perspective, not addressed at all and not solved at all yet, because in fact, like when I recently read the book by Harari, the Homo Deus, and I think he mentioned this new complexity, how one field has an impact on another, and our degree of specialization doesn't allow us to solve the problems, because we are all too specialized on one aspect, and nobody, he mentions, sees what is the impact of artificial intelligence on nanotechnology on biotechnology, and so on and so forth. And I carry that also to the WTO and the relationship to the UN. We can also see that in the past, it seems really that we haven't learned from the history, other than that we never learned from history, because the International Trade Organization was a beautiful project, and I think it was partially realized then with the WTO. But for example, it was already also more progressive with regard to maybe some competition rules, which are probably lacking today globally when we look at the challenges of multinationals and especially cyber technologies and all this which operates in such a complex environment where borders are anyways only fictitious or virtual. So I would hope for such a golden opportunity, that this crisis will be this golden opportunity where these differences can be overcome. And here I am probably already influenced from the 15 years that I live in Asia, first in India and then now in Macau, China, that I see from the Chinese approach, cognitive approach, I found a lot of inspiration where there's greater emphasis on the complementarity precisely between trade and non-trade issues, which is a misnomer. I also found that, for example, I wrote also some articles 10 years ago about the notion of developing countries and developed countries, which even linguistically is a misnomer in a way, because one is a static notion of being in a certain state, either developed or not developed, whereas the other one is a dynamic one, which is, and in the article I said we all want to be living in developing countries because the only certainty, the only constant in life is change. So you have to keep developing. And then it was interesting that a few years later I saw that an American professor from the MIT then said that the US is now regressing. So that confirmed in a way that the distinction is artificial, for example. And again, we are comparing something that isn't even comparable, and we are even creating a difference between two things which are not even opposites. And I think especially in China, the Chinese response also now to the COVID crisis seems like to be more inclusive or not kind of separating dichotomies. This is something I've seen in the past, and I've also, with my research assistant, we looked at it, and Professor Hang Wang from UNSW, he also published now a forthcoming article where he mentions cognition and perception as very important factors for designing the future and also like shaping the future. And China here is moving from a kind of selective adaptation, he says, to a selective reshaping. And I think in all these challenges today, especially with regard to complexity and an extremely rapid pace of change, the greater uncertainty that law faces here because of these changing conditions can probably only be better addressed with an appropriate cognitive framework. But I try, at least with the students, I'm practicing a lot of paradoxical thinking and to find creative solutions. And I would just really hope to see again, like as I remember from my time as a student as well, some really like a visionary project to come up at the global level to really deserve the name of global legal studies, which can be first even like it should be a project by scholars, like rewriting and like or even start thinking of a global legal order, which is so far, I think the only book I found is called Theorizing a Global Legal Order, but it's a book, and I would like to see more follow-up action. And I think that, especially from China, my perspective is that the support for multilateralism is there. China is like every other jurisdiction and every other legal system challenge, meeting a lot of serious challenges internally, globally, and from the complexity. But there's a will to use the law and to try to improve the situation. And just to give one example about the law, even Macau and the Chinese constitution have that with regard to medicines. I wrote an article some years ago in the Macau basic law. There's a clause which says that the government is basically obliged to promote both conventional and traditional medicines at the same time. And I was shocked that when you go to a public hospital here, you have 4 or 5 floors conventional medicine, and then the last floor or another floor is just designated for traditional Chinese medicine. which is unthinkable, for example, in Austria, where there's a big feud between conventional doctors and so-called traditional doctors, even traditional Austrian medicine, if you want. So these are examples where complementarity, I think, will in the end be the way to success, because even from my year-long study of culture and trade, in the beginning, I saw the two sides. The French-Canadian side was very much in favor of just exempting culture, exception culturelle, and American studios said, no, this is protectionism. And later I remember I met a manager of an American cinema distribution chain in Madrid who was confronted with these local content requirements. And then he said, in the end, we made more money with it, because people who would never come to see an American movie, but were now offered also local content, they came and then they also watched an American movie. So I think in the end, most conflicts, there is no irresolvable conflict, and we can just, I think, minimize the harm and speed up a little bit, hopefully, the time we need to find the key to the solution of the problem. And I think time is something that we are a bit running out, from my perspective, when it comes to especially environmental issues and sustainability issues, and also a lot of social issues and health issues in the end. So from that perspective, I would like to see a push, in particular from policymakers and politicians, to design a more like a long-term project, because this is also something, living in a jurisdiction where a contract was made in a way, a treaty for 50 years, one learns to think beyond even one's lifetime. But I hope this makes sense at midnight, and I would be happy to clarify some or receive, in fact, answers to some of the questions I raised, maybe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rostam. I have to say thank you to all the, and first of all, Rostam, thank you very much for underlining out of crisis comes opportunity. I'm interested as well in your sort of, in the ways in which China, I should say, maybe supporting multilateralism, things to meeting new challenges. I just thank all the panelists. It's a tremendous group of people we've got here, very diverse, very illustrious. So fantastic perspectives and views. And I should thank the participants. Also, it's great to see also scholars, academics, researchers here, as well as practitioners. I should say hello in particular to Tony Parry, who I haven't seen for many years. Hello, Tony. So the plan now, in the remaining time we've got, there's not very much, I think, is to hand over to Lindsay, who will identify some questions from the chat, and perhaps we can direct these to one or another of the panel members to give perhaps a main answer, and the others can throw in comments if they like. How does that sound?
Sure. So what I found is that there seems to be some themes that are coming through the questions. And so because some of these speakers have, there's a few of them have spoken to a theme, I guess it's kind of directed at those themes. So we were hoping to do each panelist, but I think that we'll approach it by themes, because that might just get through the questions in a shorter amount of time. So let's see if I can do this. One of the themes that came through clearly was discussions on developing and what it means to be developing. So let's try this. Whether the issue of developing is linked to or could be linked to dispute settlement issues. Carolyn asked, do you think that there would be any merit in recognizing a category between developed and developing, perhaps particularly regarding China, as that impacts the US viewpoint? And if so, could this be tied with driving climate change agenda forward? Along the same sort of lines, Harrison wrote to Professor Marco, if the starting point for the developing countries issue is equality of states, is she saying that the WTO should abandon SDT? Maybe she can expand on this. I guess more broadly then, since the US category is somewhat problematic, what would a more reasonable criteria be? So I guess that's kind of directed at, say, Andrew and Kolo and Gabrielle as well. Kolo, do you want to start? You're nodding.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what the first question, whether the question was whether developing countries can use special and differential treatment in the context of dispute settlement.
I think it's, sorry, I think that they were just trying to refer to, is this one of the key issues that the US is taking with the dispute settlement issues, is the definition of developing, and perhaps the use of different countries. Yeah.
Okay, so the US's viewpoints, as I said in my presentation, mostly has to do with negotiations. The US does not think that some members should take less obligations or should have longer time frames or should not take, the same level of obligations as developed countries, whereas they're fully capable, in the US's opinion, to do so. And so obviously in the context of dispute settlement, yes, there are some special differential, provisions where members can ask for longer timeframes or whatever, but this is not the main issue of contention for the US. It's really what type of obligations members can and cannot take because they classify themselves as developing and developed countries. And on the issue of whether there's a category whether there could be a category between developing and developed, that's very tricky because already we have so much problems just, agreeing on what developing is. It's, I guess members can self-select, but other members can choose not to agree with that selection. There are economies in transition, but that's a completely different type of country that we're talking about, the former Soviet states. So I don't know what the value of further compounding confusion into this debate, and maybe this goes to the objective criteria that can be taken. Yes, I think everybody would agree, and even some of the the countries that oppose this would agree that not all developing countries are equal. And when you put a blanket definition over, for example, I don't know, Cote d'Ivoire, and maybe I would choose Singapore because Singapore said it's not going to avail itself to SNDNT, there is obviously stark discrepancies, and obviously other members would not be happy to treat these two countries equally. And so that's when we need to engage with objective criteria. And in my opinion, criteria that do not recognize the human development indicators would do a disservice to some really, big countries that are suffering with, poverty. India has got about 36% of all poor people in the world. And it's one of the countries that the US wants to exclude. So yes, it's a very contentious topic, but I don't think that it's one that we can treat in a blanket fashion that has been done before. There's a lot of nuance. As for the climate change issue, I think I'm going to leave it to Andrew. I'm not quite sure what the link was there, but I'll leave it to Andrew if Andrew knows, how the climate change can be linked to development.
Thank you very much, Kolo. Andrew, do you want to pick up on that one?
I'm happy to, though I have to admit I missed the climate change bit, Lindsay, but I have a few things to say. Maybe I can just mention that. I quickly respond on this developing country issue and link it a little bit to the question that I see in the chat about joint statement initiatives. It's sort of anyway, I'll just do that link. So on developing countries, in the context of this conversation, I don't have much to say about specifically how developing countries, different ways of categorizing and so on. I don't really, for this conversation, I don't want to go down that direction. But I guess I would just say two very general things. One is this, that there's a difference between, we all know, but just to state, there's a difference between special and differential treatment, which is a kind of multiple speed liberalization. In other words, fewer and more relaxed and longer duration liberalization obligations for developing countries, whether that's graded for different kinds of developing countries or not. and a different kind of special and differential treatment, which is particularly shaping the international trade governance in response to particular development needs. And I guess that was, although there were many things wrong with what the appellate body did in the tariff preferences case, that was the genius of that decision, which was to say, look, when you're doing something which is special and differential treatment, it must be responsive to particular development needs. And I do think that there's a lot to be said for that way of thinking about special and differential treatment as opposed to the sort of multiple speed approach. And that would necessitate being much more specific, actually. What is the specific need that we're interested in? How do we particularly respond to that, And so one of the reasons why I think this is the second thing I wanted to say, was that one of the reasons why I think that's possibly maybe a better way of thinking about special and differential treatment, though I don't want to say anything too strong like that, but is that, multiple speed initiatives like these joint statement initiatives, here's my link, inevitably, I think we have to be realistic about this, is that inevitably they lead to points like we have now, which is where, where countries go ahead, I mean that in a non-normative sense, they press ahead with certain obligations, others are exempted from them, or they move ahead in a plurilateral way or whatever. Then at some point you get a moment like this where those who move ahead draw a line in the sand and say, either you come with us, or we destroy this, or we destroy the system, or we move to something very different. I mean, in a sense, that's the logical endpoint, or not quite the logical endpoint, but I think a very determined endpoint of these sorts of initiatives. And so I think what we're seeing now is, in a way, the outcome of that. That's all I had to say. But I'm sorry I didn't touch on the climate change thing. But if we come back to that, if we have a chance, otherwise I'm happy to respond to that. Maybe by an email or something.
Gabrielle, over to you. You were
Thank you.
next in line.
Well, when I said, I think I agree fully with Andrew, when I said that all states are equal, it's also saying that it's not the job of WTO to decide whether different states are of different level of development. It's not a development sort of agency. There are differences. But you have to realize, I think, that you have an organization where 2/3 of the members start with the premise, I'm different. Well, you're different from what? Because maybe we should start with developing countries type rules and then have exception for the developed. It's a funny pattern of negotiation where the starting point is 2/3 or whatever, 3/4. I'm not like the others, or I'm not, we're different. So my point is just the difficulty of negotiating and then going into things as deep as who's a developing and not developing country. I would not touch this, maybe. I would look at, a bit like it was done for trade facilitation, maybe, specific provisions that are negotiated and they're adapted. And I would personally stop looking at developing country status. Even this makes me jump. And I would say maybe they're different economic power, and this is what we should care about. China is on the Security Council, blow up the planet. I'm not saying they don't have poverty, but I'm saying going by provision like S&D, going by situation is much more manageable than making big declaration and whether China is developing or developed. I wouldn't touch that. And I agree with the link with climate change, but to me, I make it again a more modest link. If you read the chapeau of Article 20, it says that you cannot discriminate without justification between countries where the same conditions prevail, I think is the term. So this is, to me, exactly this. Countries in different conditions. For one situation, it may be different for another area of trade. I remember once Korea saying, we are a developing country in agriculture, but a most advanced in financial service. There's somebody who has the microphone on because I think it's Colo. So that's all. Climate change, you need to treat differently the very poor, but I'm not sure that that it would not be reflected in their level of emission in any case. You don't maybe need to go into, is it developing? You will say different conditions, different level. And I agree, as I think it's Andrew who spoke about that initially. They're very strong proposal now. The EU proposal is quite advanced. It's discussed at the OECD everywhere. So it's going to be an opportunity, something that we'll need to handle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Given time, Lindsay, do you want to do one more round?
One more round. Oh, okay. So do we want to ask a question about Trump and the US or about COVID response?
Ask Rostam what he wants. He didn't speak.
Ah,
What do you want, Rostam?
from the chat. What piques your interest?
Well, I mean, both is interesting. I think if I briefly say two things about both things. One thing that I see as a major problem is my most recent interest now is like is actually, especially since one is locked down in a place and relies on virtual media and so on, is the representation or the misrepresentation of situations in the media, and how that affects also like our legal thinking and legal reasoning, because and I think it is both with regard to President Trump and to the situation of the responses to COVID. There's a lot of debate about fake news, and now also like I even see a lot of tweets are being blocked. I can't access them because the algorithm has already selected it that this is harmful for me, and so on. So I'm worried in that sense that we are in this virtual space not getting the right stimuli and information. And then again, I always end up with problems of cognition and perception, because if you're fed the wrong information, you will take the wrong decisions most likely. And in that respect, I think we need to address deeper questions. And I think I heard even that no matter how the election in the US will go out, not much will change. Maybe the rhetoric will change, but probably the path development of this planet and the humanity is set to continue, and unless we find a more drastic, I think, change in the cognition that allows us then to question all these things from a very different perspective. And like developing and developed countries, like I think we need to have a completely different approach to oppositions and dichotomies, in fact, because it is divisive. I think to introduce this dichotomy, which is a false one of developing and developed, brings a division already into a body and into the whole world, which is artificial, like all the national, I mean, the borders, and in this in particular with a virus, I mean, which doesn't stop at the border at all. So I am afraid that from that perspective, we need to question our cognitive, our perception, and find ways to and I believe it starts with every individual to start thinking differently with regard to contradictions, and that paradoxes are only apparent contradictions, and there's always a way to solve any contradiction. And in that respect, I also think it is vain again to discuss something like the status of special and differential treatment without considering the coherence of the whole system, and that includes all trade and non-trade issues. One cannot make a decision anymore, like in IP law, for example, just the TRIPS agreement or something, without considering tax law and other regulatory fields, from competition law to trade law. So again, I always end up with looking inside the brain as the source of all normativity, and from there we need to bring the change, and language change is a first step to bring thoughts into reality. And that's why I think maybe abandoning this developed country dichotomy frees some cognitive space for new ideas. And I think we have created already a technological reality alone, which is very substantively different from what the world looked like just a few decades ago. And we need to look for new solutions and not just try to reinvent old ones.
Henry, can I step in a second?
Please,
Yeah.
Gabrielle, of course.
Just to support what Rostam just said, that's why I was impressed by all these collaboration, because we need to look at the problem horizontally. Not only in one discipline, but I think the issue of COVID, at least, I mean, the crisis is broader than that, but the issue of COVID has to do with the way we live, with deforestation, with animals, and, you know, it's a complicated issue. And we cannot just look at WTO, it cannot just be government. So it's really complicated vertically and horizontally and in all disciplines, and philosophy also. But we cannot do everything here in WTO, of course. But to be open to those all form of partnership is the beginning of realizing how little we are with huge problems. That's all.
May I jump in on that one, on that note, and abuse my chair's privilege? So two things. One, just back to Gabrielle, we've had a request to share your document. So perhaps, could you email that to Alex, and perhaps she can distribute it to the attendees. On the lines of horizontal partnerships, I guess, I'm struck by Gail's question. Is there a concern with the management of COVID about good governance principles, particularly public-private partnerships, ACT, COVAX, as to how they can be held responsible under international or domestic law? The nature of these developments means there will be a lag in developing other areas of law, such as addressing the rules of responsibility and international law to fit public-private partnerships. In other words, are these partners being governed sufficiently, do you think? Or how do we ensure better management?
Well, I'm stepping in. How to ensure is to start being open-minded and talk to one another and expand the scope. The problem is everything cannot be done at the WTO. It has to start with academics, I think, who throw outside ideas. And maybe in regional trade agreements that are smaller groups, and then you give ideas to others. It's complicated because we need private and public together, and we need at different levels.
Thanks. I think let's start. I'm going to abuse chair's privilege again and start thinking about bringing things to a close. It's been a really wonderful discussion. As the title of the panel reflects, 2020 is arguably an inflection point. It's been an interesting year, I think it's fair to say. In addition to COVID, we have elections in the US, we have, so to say, the final disintegration in the appellate body. We have Brexit, of course, from the UK perspective. And I was struck by sort of Colo's reminding us that we've seen really growths in trade barriers, tariff, non-tariff, in the last several years amongst the G20, I think you mentioned, Colo. So I wonder, and I'll put it to the panel, are we going to see more or less protectionism in the coming, say, 5 years? And if so, why? What will the drivers be of changes in trade governance? And trade behavior, I should say, as well. So going back to initial order, Colo, do you want to have a go first?
I would like to be cheeky and say it depends on who wins the election next week, but no, really, I mean, I think also regardless of who wins the US election next week, I think in my personal opinion, there will be an increase in protectionism. I think sort of the romantic era of multilateralism, especially at the WTO as a trade regulating body, unless if things drastically change, that era is gone. And of course, countries are inherently self-interested, and they will advance their self-interest at the detriment of others. And so, yes, it's a very pessimistic outlook, but in my humble opinion, a very realistic one, given the environment that we're operating in right now.
Thank you. The joys of Zoom. Sorry to hear that, but it makes perfect sense. Turning next, I think, Andrew, you're up. What's your take on the coming years? Doing a better.
Maybe I'll just say one or two things. So you asked specifically more or less protectionism. So my response to that specific question is that's usually, I don't feel as if that's the best axis upon which to define the future and past, more or less protectionism. So I think we are obviously at a pivot point between different kinds, I think, of trading system. I wouldn't necessarily characterize the future as more protectionist or less protectionist, but I think, yeah, we're going to see some really pretty radical changes in the location of production and the location of value. So I see the change primarily as a change, in a sense, the rules of the game, as opposed to whether the game is market or less market, and so on. The rules of the market-oriented game. But just in the interests of, wait, I know we're running out of time. Well, I just wanted to say there are a couple of questions in the chat which I just thought might be worth just saying something about, just in the interest of giving everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not that I have anything particularly brilliant to say about them, but Gail, you had this question about the MPIA and how big a deal is it, or what difference is it going to make? And my very quick response to that is that for me, the MPIA, so yeah, on one sense, it's a stopgap, but for me, it's about setting a different position for future negotiations. In other words, the US was essentially creating a new status quo, creating a new position from which future negotiations may occur, and the role of the MPIA is essentially to hold on to a degree of that status quo, which then changes the dynamics of future negotiations. That's how I that's how I sort of think about its importance in my head. It's not that it's going to maintain the appellate body in some more general sense at all. And then just quickly, there was a really interesting question on the BRI and the BRI and how and whether it's going to be a challenge for the WTO dispute settlement system. Boy, what an interesting question. And it's just because it got me thinking, what does it mean for the BRI to be a challenge to dispute settlement? I guess the only thing that can mean is that disputes around BRI projects tend to go to a dispute settlement mechanism, which is something other than WTO appellate body, even when it could, and that dispute settlement mechanism might somehow push in different directions. Now, if I reframe the question that way, I think for sure, of course, that's going to happen. And whether that's a challenge to the appellate body or not, I don't know, but I can definitely foresee that happening. Whether that's different from the existing situation, I'm not really sure, in the sense that most trade disputes are not resolved in and through formal WTO dispute settlement, and there are a lot of different regional and other normative regimes, and I'm not even talking about free trade agreements. I'm just talking about different ways of resolving commercial disputes, which coexist with the WTO system. And so I'm not sure that I would see it a challenge in a sort of a confrontational sense in that sense. But if the specific question is, will it draw potential disputes away from the trading system and its processes into a different one, then yeah, I would have thought definitely it's going to do that.
Thanks so much. Gabrielle, you're up.
Okay. On BRI, I would just say that I thought most provisions are investment provisions, but there are investment provisions under GATS. Kolo knows them well. So it does happen often that a single action by a government is at the same time a violation of WTO, of an FTA, of a customs union, especially in Africa where you have all these things overlapping. So possibly, but the problem of BRI is more whether it will deliver what it promised, because there are high costs for the countries involved towards China from them. That's more, in my view, a political issue more than a dispute issue.
Would you like to speak to rephrase Andrew's, or to paraphrase Andrew, I should say, to the prospects for protectionism, are we at an inflection point in, what was it you said, trying to find the line you used, Andrew, the allocation of the production and benefits. Did I get that right? Production and...
I think I said value, but I'm very happy with benefit too.
You know, this, the US slogan, I think Andrew has heard me say that a million times in Colo, the US slogan after the Second World War, towards the end of it, to encourage governments to join in, was if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. I always start all my classes for 25 years with that. This was the pattern. And I explained that economists are clever, they have all sorts of curves, but basically, if you trade with your neighbor country, you will wait until they pay you before shooting them. And then everybody's a bit, oh, well, it's simple, but crises force countries to link. We need to link to deal with this COVID and climate change, because there's a question. I'm not saying COVID is more important than climate change. These are crises that go to the sustainability of humankind. It's damn serious. And there is no way we can deal with it with the structure as it stands. That's why I fully agree with Rostam's statement and your opening that these issues are completely planetarian. I don't think that even the pandemic of 1918 was as broad as this one. The Spanish, they call it. And same thing with climate change. It is really everywhere. So we have to change. I just don't know how to proceed. I think there's a big burden on academics because they can speak, and journalism and regional agreements because it's smaller and easier to do things, and it could expand a bit like EC expanded into now this 27. I believe in regional trade agreements as laboratories. It's far from perfect, but at least you can move. And I believe very much in GSI. This is why I support Andrew, that this is a top question. GSI, how to fit it in the system while respecting non-discrimination. And I don't see mutual recognition as an exception. I think it's another form of staged MFN. Thank you.
Thank you. And for closing comments, Rostam, we're at an inflection point. What next and why?
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, that was last year very interesting. The project launched by Junji Nakagawa and Colin Picker with this question of a post-WTO order. I don't know, the book is out already since July. So the whole question was, can you envisage a dystopian and a utopian scenario for a world without WTO, basically, if it fails or will be replaced by WTO 2.0. And the interesting question for me was at the time, like how to predict the future, basically. And in doing research for my paper, and I made it a science fiction, basically, because I placed it in the year 2048, and then I tried to describe a dystopian and a utopian scenario. And at the same time, I read a neuroscientific work which said that from the perspective of the brain, a good or a bad decision is almost the same. And when I finished the paper, I realized that the dystopian and the utopian scenario is almost identical, because we have all the knowledge scientific about the dangers of deforestation or certain lifestyles and endless growth and exploiting the oceans and nature and so on. So my prediction is simply, first of all, I don't think it will be globally the same. I think some countries will push for protectionism, those that need the protectionism, and others will push for liberalization, as it always was. It, unfortunately, as I can experience tonight, it is on a round spherical body. It is night in one place and I'm sleepy, and it is daylight somewhere else. And it will be a push for liberalization now in the East, and in the West, it will be maybe more protectionism. And I'm appalled because I grew up in 30 kilometers away from the Iron Curtain, and I was like fed by the media and by everything, like with a clear distinction of the world in East and West, and capitalist and communist, and now I live in the other on the other side, and now actually I don't know where is the US actually, East or West, and where is capitalism, where is communism? It is time to get rid of these dichotomies, and I think my conclusive, my finding from my research on how to predict the future is the best way of predicting is to create it. And the law has this inherent power, like science fiction, to create a scenario, and fictitious scenario. We have legal fictions, and then things will happen. And language plays a very important role to realizing these fictions and making them happen. That's why I read once the law changes because language changes, and that's why we need to change the thinking. And then I hope the expected results will come as well. So I hope that's a conclusion.
Thank you. That's a really terrific note to close on, Rostam. Thank you very much. And thank you for staying with us so late. I think one of the wonderful things about Zoom and perhaps side effects of the crisis is that we can have participants so easily in the same place from New York to Macau in the same event, which otherwise would be terribly difficult, or much more difficult to organize. It's really been a wonderful experience having you all together. Thank you very much to the presenters, organizers, and the attendees. And I very much hope that our paths will cross in person in future and not just virtually. Thank you so much. Have a good morning or evening.
Thank you to all the organizers behind the curtains.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.